another phrase that sounds just wonderful. That is, every American has a right to health care. That's an interesting phrase. Let's think about that a little bit. There was once a country that doesn't exist right now that had the idea that everybody had a right to certain basic things. For instance, if it gets really cold outside, you should have a right to housing, because if you don't have a warm place to live, you'll freeze to death. So they said everybody should have a right to housing. And if you don't have food to eat, you'll starve to death. So everybody should have a right to food. And they said that everybody should have a right to education, you should be able to read. And so in each of these cases, the government was going to provide housing and food and education. The government said that also you needed to have a right to have a job. And so the government was going to provide the job, and the government, of course, said that you had to have a right to health care. And so the government was going to provide your health care. And so this idea that because it's essential for your survival to have housing or food or education or a job or health care, to say then, or to assume that therefore it's a right, is to make the same assumption that was made by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. We used to call them commies when I was younger. And how well did their system work? It didn't work very well. Lots of people got lousy health care, starved to death, froze to death, and were persecuted and killed by their government because they had an assumption that you had a right to all these different things. But I think that when our founders started America, they talked about a right to something else. A right to life, a right to liberty, a right to pursue happiness. What's the difference between those things? Well, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is something that is granted by God to each and every individual citizen. Nobody else gives you that, only God Himself. When you talk about a right to food, does that mean that the farmer has to be your slave and give you food, which is the product of the sweat of his brow? I don't think so. We call that stealing. And so we need to be a little careful when we talk about rights a little bit too quickly, because when you assume you have a right, then it's the government's job to enforce it, and pretty soon you end up with public option, or essentially one choice, and that is the government running everything.